a history here that binds this family together like few others.
The Kukla family tree is now 180 feet long. Among those
when 500 members of the Jewish Kukla family got together in England a few years ago for their first ever reunion, that story got a lot of attention. Even the BBC covered it, as you can hear. They were all descended from the same man, Abba of Kuklya, a tiny village in Lithuania where he'd lived in the late 1700s. He had 9 sons and some daughters, and they all went on to produce huge families of their own. And so, with the passage of generations, and despite hundreds of their relatives being wiped out in the Holocaust, the Kuklas believe they are now part of the largest documented Ashkenazi Jewish family tree in the world, including some pretty famous cousins like singers Barbara Streisand, Bob Dylan, and Bette Midler, and comedian Billy Crystal, just to name a few. There are also relatives in Canada, including Ralph Cilevitz, who lives in Toronto, and he's been trying to track down the Canuck branch.
I think for many years I felt alone. I felt that our family was small, and I had a sense of not being part of anything. So now that I'm part of this amazing family, I can reach out to many, many countries around the world, and I will have a cousin or a relative there.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like for Tuesday, August the 30th, 2022. Welcome to the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia. It all started when Ralph Cilevitz took a DNA test through one of those ancestry genealogy sites a couple of years ago. He was already the family historian, but the test results led him to discover he's one of the tens of thousands of cousins in the Kukla tribe. Cilevitz has just come back from New York City, where he attended the first ever reunion held on this side of the Atlantic. He was the only Canadian there, but he's sure he'll find more relatives in this country. He's also looking in South Africa, where he was born. Coming up, Ralph will be here to tell us how he schmoozed his way into a private meeting with his new cousin, Billy Crystal, on Broadway, and how to find out if you're related too. But first, here's what's making news elsewhere in Canada right now.
I am Rabbi Lionel Moses in Sacramento, California, and also in Montreal, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like.
It appears that public pressure and the threat of sanctions by Ontario's funeral home regulator have pushed Benjamin's, Toronto's largest Jewish funeral operator, to conduct a major overhaul of how it runs parts of its business. The managing director, Michael Benjamin, announced on Monday his company's already started to make changes in response to growing calls for more transparency. The changes come in the wake of a series of investigations by the Ontario Funeral Industry's licensing body, the Bereavement Authority of Ontario. In an email to the CJN, Michael Benjamin says, quote, "We recognize there are concerns and have listened to the feedback," unquote. Most significantly, they're temporarily suspending their controversial decades-old practice of deducting 10% in administration fees to cover the costs of processing charitable memorial donations through the Benjamins Foundation. Benjamin's has been in the news for weeks after a grieving Toronto couple, Raziel and Jeanne Ziesman, went public here on the CJN Daily podcast about those 10% fees and their battle with the Benjamins Foundation after their son Liam died. Ontario's Bereavement Authority has warned Benjamins it has to be more upfront with its vulnerable customers on things like charging in advance for tombstones when people had not ordered them, or levying special COVID fees during the pandemic, even though the industry had been urged not to. Despite the announcement promising changes, Benjamin's lawyers have gone to court to appeal the BAO's orders to pay back all the admin fees they took from the Ziesmans and other customers dating back 6 years. And Ralph Cilevitz joins us now from his home in Toronto. We need to tell people how you first got involved with this gigantic genealogy project.
Well, for me, growing up in South Africa, our family was very small. There was my father. He had 3 siblings, and the rest of the family were all killed in 1941 by the Germans. So I grew up thinking that there were only maybe 5 or 6 or 7 of us in the family, but I started to look for other members of the family. So about 2 years ago, I did a DNA test to one of the ancestry websites, and I found that I was closely connected by, I think, a second cousin by a fellow in Pittsburgh. And so I contacted him, he was also looking for family. And we tried to see how far back we could go, but we could really only go back to about our great-grandfather. But he mentioned that there was a fellow in England called Ian Levine who was doing research on the same family and others. So I contacted Ian, and he had been working on this for 25 years. And believe it or not, my family went from 75 to over 75,000 in one day.
That's mind-boggling.
So it's a really interesting history. If I can indulge you for a minute, the way it worked was that there was a man called Zalman Joffe who lived in Lithuania, and the family actually didn't go the regular route that the Jews, when they left the Holy Land, our side of the family went to Venice, Italy, and then to France, and then to Czechoslovakia, and eventually they were pushed into the Pale. So they ended up in Lithuania. And this Zalman was born in a little town called Kuklya in Lithuania. Today, the population is 24. But at its height, it was about 100 people. He lived there for a few years, and then he moved into Latvia, and he went to a town called Rezekne, or Režista, and he lived there. This town of Rezekne was close to three other towns, Karsava, Ludza, and Varklan, and my family, my dad and his ancestors came from Karsava. But these four towns were quite removed from the rest of Latvia. They were in the west, not too far from anything. So because people didn't travel, they tended to marry each other from those families. And as a result, over the 400 years since he emigrated to Latvia, the family have really kept in very close touch with each other. And once I got hold of this Ian fellow, he told me about the family. He actually showed me my great, going all the way back 17 generations to 1521. And it's been just a great journey since then.
You were saying because of the Holocaust, your direct ancestors, and many of them were wiped out. But now we see 75,000 people, and some of them have come together. There's been TV shows about it in England. What is it like when you go to a reunion and you realize that, Hitler didn't get everybody, right?
It's a very peculiar feeling to go from feeling completely alone and you have a small family to realizing that there's a lot of you around. And even though some of them looked like me, a lot of them didn't look like me. But it was a great sense of just being involved with a family.
Can you tell me how far widespread the Kukla descendants live now from their home base 400 years ago? Where have they populated?
Originally, as Litvaks, they did seem to disperse in different areas. And if you go back to the different countries that were allowing people in around the Second World War, I found it interesting that in Canada, the majority of Jews came from Poland. In South Africa, where I came from, the majority of Jews came from Lithuania and some from Latvia. The majority of Jews in Australia come from Hungary. So it depends on what year and which countries were allowing Jews in. That's where we went.
How many of there are in Canada? Because we're the Canadian Jewish News. So do you have numbers for that?
We have just begun to look into that. We estimate at least 50 to 100, just at a minimum. So if you want to give me that question in about 3 to 6 months, I'll update you.
All right. Well, we'll put a link to your, contact you so people who think they are can get in touch for sure, right?
And the interesting thing is that we have fairly common names in the family. The original man was called Joffe, Joffe, which is a fairly common name in South Africa. But we have Levines, we have Cohens, we have Kagans, We have Katzenellenbogen. There's a whole...
Hold on a minute. That's my mother-in-law, is Katzenellenbogen. Hello.
Okay. Well, we have lots of those.
Wow. But she shortened it to Bogan when they came to Canada. Wow.
Interesting.
All right. So that's interesting. But maybe I'm related to you. That would be crazy for my husband.
It would be very
My
fun.
husband would be related to you. Bogan for sure. Katzenellenbogen. A lot of the things that when I was researching some of this before we spoke, there were some large families and lots of offspring of people, like 9 kids, 18 kids. What do you make of this? Is that why there's so many of you now?
Well, I looked into that, and it seems that when all the years of trouble for the Jews began, way back in the 1400s probably, Queen Isabella, etc., the Jews were a threatened race, and they were being killed. They were being forced to convert to Catholicism, and the rabbis actually stepped up, and they suggested that people have more kids, only to protect the life of the race. So I went back and I looked at some of my great grandmothers, and I saw one of them had 14 kids, and her kids had about a dozen, and their kids had about 10. So it doesn't take very long before you have a whole string of people.
So I also want to ask you about, I mean, you're famous, but really famous people who are part of this family tree. Can you give us a couple of names?
Well, we have a lot of entertainers in the family. Probably the best known is Barbara Streisand. There's Bette Midler. There's Billy Crystal. There's Gene Wilder, Michael and Kirk Douglas. The list goes on, and even Sigmund Freud is on the list.
And did they ever get invited to any of these reunions? And did you meet any of them?
I actually met Billy Crystal when I went to the New York reunion. We did invite him, and unfortunately he was doing a show called Mr. Saturday Night, and so my wife and I decided to go and see the show. And what I had done is written a little note to him beforehand. I gave it to the usher, who gave it to Billy, and the usher told me to wait after the show, and I did. And sure enough, Billy came out, and he came towards me. I said, "Billy, we're mishpacha." So he laughed, and he had read the note, and he, in fact, one of his family was glass, and he was so excited to see that I knew that part of the family, and I quickly showed him how we are related. I believe it's my great times 8 grandmother and his great times 8 grandmother were sisters.
That is the coolest thing I've heard in a long time.
Well, I forgot to tell you that Bob Dylan is on our family tree as well. His cousin was at the reunion, and apparently they don't talk.
Right, because like all Jewish families, there's Bruegges.
That's right.
They have Bruegges too. Now that you met all these amazing people and you're plugged into this tracing the tribe kind of mentality, what's next for you?
Well, my family tree will expand exponentially from all these people because I don't know what their side of the tree is. So that's the first thing. But I will probably keep in touch with at least a dozen of them. They're just nice people. And knowing that we're family just brings us a little closer together.
Later this week, Cilevitz will be presenting the Ontario Jewish Archives with copies of a large book documenting his Kukla family tree. If you want to get in touch with him, just drop me a note and I'll connect you. I'm at ebessner@thecjn.ca. And that's what Jewish Canada sounds like for this episode of the CJN Daily, sponsored by Metropia. Integrity, community, quality, and customer care. Today's listener shout-out goes to Helen Shapiro. She liked our story about the 125th anniversary of the First Zionist Congress. And we'll end the show with a reminder that we will be at the Ashkenazi Jewish Music Festival in Toronto at the Harbourfront Centre on the Labor Day weekend on Sunday and Monday. So come by, look for the CJN's booth. Stop by and have a meet and greet with your favorite CJN personalities and get a chance to be on the Daily. The link to the Ashkenaz Festival is also in our show notes. Thanks for listening.